Hello and welcome to a lock-in at the Crate and Crowbar. This week we are going to be blasting through 50 of the best films to be released this side of the millennium as picked by myself, Marsh Davis. I'm just an idiot guy, just some demi-human scum not worthy to screech my film opinions at you from the dank interior of a cave. And joining me is the eminently more qualified actual screenwriter and reportedly full human, Jamie Britton.
Hello, king of movies, sitting on my throne above a cloud of, I'm guessing, a mixture of pizza boxes and old DVD cases, with my absolute judgment.
Your rightful place in this hierarchy. Jamie, welcome.
Hello.
We've each picked like 25-ish films. It's not actually quite an even split because we duplicated some and then you picked others which I wish I'd thought of. But it's more or less like half each.
Yes.
And I'm really excited to get into this with you because you've actually picked quite a lot of films that I'd not only not seen, but I hadn't even fucking heard of. And I thought that, like, until moving countries in 2016, I was really on the ball when it came to film. Like, I consider myself a bit of a cineast, you know. And but I'm really interested to hear about some of these picks because I expect I'll be hoovering some of these up after this podcast. But just before we get into that list, do you think it's been a good couple of decades for film? And sort of what's your engagement been with film at the cinema been across this period?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird, isn't it? Because it's been a considerable chunk of my life this new century. You know, I was 15 in 2000, and now I'm 30. How old am I? 30. It's been a long
old to remember.
Yeah, but I'm now 22 years older than that, and yeah, it's kind of weird because that's a huge amount of time. I remember I had a lot of fun. This period encompasses the amount of time where like I was going to the cinema because you're in that space where you can't go and get pissed as a teenager. So the cinema is where you end up. I was remembering going to see the movie Stepmom with my friend.
Oh yeah, a classic which has not made it to this list.
No, Stepmom not. I mean, pre-millennial. I think it's sort of painfully pre-millennial, that movie. But it kind of goes through there, and then like another thing I think about is like in 2003 and 2004, I was at university in London, and I was completely miserable. And there was really cheap movies you could go and see in the day in London because I was so stupid. I went to university in London, so you could go and see like movies for £4. And I just saw everything. I saw the Punisher movie.
Wow.
I saw like scary movie sequels that I would like never.
Well, let's not spoil this list,
and then it's been a kind of real. I don't know. I mean, people have talked a lot about where movies are going and the kind of the slow death of them, which I think probably is quite imminent. But it is that kind of thing of like, most movies are just kind of okay, and then there is a very small percentage of them which are just the best thing in the world, and a lot of the movies on this list, like it's quite low on comedy, I think, although I've tried to put a few in, and quite low on genre, which I feel very ashamed about. But often my favourite movies, and I sound like such a toss piece saying this, but often my favourite movies are the ones that kind of break my heart, where it feels like someone's got into my insides and given me a good old squeezing.
Yeah.
And you kind of deposited out of the film feeling kind of emotionally exhausted, but with a kind of, a sort of the strange sense of peace that comes with that, and that's usually what the best movies do for me. And it's nice that still happens,
Yeah, it's interesting looking at this list and seeing actually not very many of the sort of the big cinematic trends that have come to sort of define the cinema in the last 5 to 10 years. I don't think we have much of that. In that, cinema has tended now towards sort of superhero films being kind of like the dominant tentpole releases of a year, and there's the sort of the rise of streaming affecting the way that films are being made and how there's more money to be made of parlaying them into multi-part series and so forth. Do you think that this list represents like the last hurrah of cinema then?
I mean, I kind of do in a horrible in a horrible way. I mean, I don't think so. I think it'll be here for a long time, but I think it will be much diminished. And there was a kind of glory era, through the kind of late 90s, up until the writer strike in America, which was when a lot of the 2008, which when or around then, when a lot of the studios were just like, right, we'll draw a line under that and let's stop bothering to make mid-budget movies, and just focus on the franchises that we can sell to China and Russia and India, and that kind of happened. And then that combined with the Netflixes of this world realizing that it just made more sense to, rather than make a 2-hour movie, to make a tiresome 9-part series about whatever the fuck. So it's kind of, TV has spread across. I mean, this has been talked about elsewhere at length, but it does make me sad, because movies are really great because they have a time limit on them, and that time limit is fundamental to a storytelling form. And once you stop bothering with that, as you do with serialized television or endlessly franchised movie, superhero series, which all blend into each other, something very fundamental is lost. So I do feel sad about that. And I think there's still plenty of stuff popping away, but I mostly worry about TV just absorbing all of the talent and all of the industry.
Well, especially now that it's hard to get to the cinema.
Yep. And it costs £3,000 to go to the cinemas.
Yeah. Although same-day streaming releases aren't that much cheaper, it turns out. But anyway, let's get into it. We've picked 50 films. It's a lot to cover, perhaps even a stupid amount to cover in a single podcast. But we will be moving briskly, hopefully. But if you end up kind of itching for more in-depth discussion of these films, I expect that quite a few of these films, I don't know if you feel this way, Jamie, will probably feature as their own lock-ins at a later date.
Yeah.
And certainly you, the audience, can suggest to us which ones you'd like to hear more about. There's obvious caveats applied to this list. I certainly haven't seen every movie, and this is obviously a partial list of films, which would be powerful to us rather than some definitive catalogue of all the films in existence. And it's also not in any order whatsoever, with the exception, I think, probably the first film we're going to talk about is, for me, the best film, which is Phantom Thread by Paul Thomas Anderson. It's a sort of low-key, demented story about a renowned dressmaker and his sister. They're at the peak of their fashion powers in the 1950s. They're making all these kind of sumptuous ball gowns for duchesses, etc. And their lives are then sort of entangled with that of a young model who becomes the dressmaker's muse and lover, before their relationship then takes on a number of much fucking stranger turns. And it's a beautiful, a brilliant story. I will, just before we discuss it, I will say we're not going to spoil anything, right?
Yes, I agree.
On this podcast, I think all the synopses we give will be just teeing up films rather than
because hopefully this will have a good few suggestions in that people can look up if they like the sound of them. Yeah.
But yeah, so Phantom Thread, it's just an incredible film by a filmmaker at the top of his powers. Incredibly measured, brilliant performances, and a deeply troubling story underneath, which is both incredibly funny but also sinister and weird. It's a fantastic film.
Yes, I agree, and just a complete swoon as well, particularly the first sort of act of it. With Johnny Greenwood, I've never heard a score like it, certainly not from him, which has this wonderful, aimless beauty to it as you're kind of meeting this couple and as they're getting together. I was really surprised by how good Phantom Thread was. I don't know why I was surprised, because Paul Thomas Anderson has not really made a bad movie and always manages to do something different. But yeah, blimey, what a dream movie Phantom Thread is.
I mean, it's a hard sell, isn't it? To make any kind of story pitch about a tailor in the 1950s. it's just like, well, okay. I mean, the second film I wanted to discuss, which I sort of paired with these in the order that we're tackling them, is There Will Be Blood, which is another Paul Thomas Anderson film, again starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And that one tells the story of Daniel Plainview, who's an eccentric oil prospector, He ruthlessly pursues riches that will absolutely not at all fill the massive void in his soul, but will poison his relationships with those he cares about and probably lead to his own destruction. I think these two films are probably neck and neck in my estimations of what the best film of the last 20 years is, and they're both by the same guy.
Yeah, just an amazing film. I mean, Magnolia is in 1999, so it doesn't make the list. But I mean, I saw that at the cinema, and I think at the time I thought it was like maybe the best movie I'd ever seen, and I still absolutely adore it. And I had the script of it at home. I used to sort of study it and pore over it. And then there was this weird thing where the next movie he made was Punch Drunk Love, which is this like weirdo, really good but really strange Adam Sandler movie. And then there was this long wait, and I remember just being on blogs in that time waiting for this movie, which was long gestating, which had this mad title to finally arrive. And I remember I went to see it on opening day, 10 o'clock in the morning at the View in Islington when I was a student. And I went and sat down in the cinema, and it was sold out. I was like, wow, it's sold out. This is great. People are really up for seeing this new movie. And I went and sat down in an empty auditorium, and then a guy poked his head round and said, the screening's been cancelled. So I went back and saw it that afternoon, but I remember it's just such a weird feeling. Anyway, it's completely irrelevant. It's an amazing movie. It was, I guess I mention it because he'd done this kind of amazing 1-2 punch with Magnolia and Boogie Nights, and then kind of taken a weird left turn with Punch Drunk Love, and then he'd kind of come back with There Will Be Blood, which feels like this kind of masterful piece of granite filmmaking, incredibly confident, incredibly unique, and just like a film for the ages. And that was just a real apotheosis moment, and really kind of fantastic to see the whole world getting so excited about it as they did.
There's an incredible solidity to his films. I'm not quite sure what it is about the way he structures and edits his films that lends it that feeling of kind of just immensity and gravity, but none of the films feel kind of flaky or off the cuff. Even when you get somebody like Daniel Day-Lewis absolutely chewing the scenery in And There Will Be Blood, it just feels incredibly precise and intentional.
Yeah, and I think he's just very, very good. I think that's like he's just one for the ages, basically. Moving on, I think to another filmmaker. I think possibly we've chosen 3 films between us from this one filmmaker, Michael Haneke. Is that how you pronounce it? Haneke?
I think so. Yeah.
So The Piano Teacher is one of mine. This is a movie from 2001 with Isabelle Huppert, adapted from the Elfriede Jelinek novel about a very disturbed piano teacher. This is a very, very hard movie to watch, like the other movies we're going to talk to by the same director. But for me, contains an absolutely perfect performance by Isabelle Huppert. I'd never seen anything like it, really, and I still think it's pretty unparalleled as a central performance for someone who is just so disturbed and tightly wound and repressed. It has such a pessimistic view of the world, that movie, that the idea that people are sort of desperate for love, but when they get that love, it's become so twisted in them what they desire that it only can hurt them, and it can only twist them up even more. And it is a very hopeless movie, I think. There really isn't much light in it at all. However, it does feel so vivid and real and kind of all-encompassing. It just completely takes you over, that movie.
I haven't seen it. This was one of when I saw your list, I was like, "Oh, what are these films? Can I quickly see?" Last night, I could actually only access 2 of them on the streaming services at my disposal. This one, deeply bleak sounding person, in deep sexual torment, and another film about child abuse. And those were my options. So I decided to just play video games instead.
Yeah,
but
that's a good
I probably will catch The Piano Teacher later, because Michael Haneke is a supremely excellent filmmaker, as we can see from The White Ribbon, which is a film we both picked. I can't remember. This is a later film of his, right? This is after The Piano Teacher.
Yes, so he's interesting because he kind of comes into the noughties after spending the previous decade kind of making weird, very specific movies that are all pretty, like, you'd call them satire or something like that. You know, there's been stuff like Funny Games or
Mm.
Benny's Video. These films which are kind of quite experimental, and he only kind of started doing things that were a bit more formally straightforward in the noughties, really. And so The Piano Teacher was at the time his most conventional movie by far. It probably still is, in fact. But then, yeah, The White Ribbon comes a little bit further down the line. Maybe we should talk about Cachet first, because that was actually released next, which you put on your list, which I didn't.
Yeah, this is one of the kind of the one of the films that really shook my understanding of what films could contain, which might sound naive, and I've since seen films that predate this that are obviously just as experimental and exciting. But at the time, so it features a successful Parisian couple, one of whose is like this literary talk show host, and they begin receiving these videotapes anonymously, which seem to be documenting their movements from afar, followed by a sequence of much more sinister and threatening gifts. The message of which is not clear, but the wife in this couple begins to suspect that something in her husband's past has provoked this, all while the behavior of the couple's son becomes more and more disturbing. And I think the kind of through line of Michael Haneke's films is that from Funny Games on is that he's sort of perverse, but in a way. So I think he's similar to Lars von Trier in a way, whereas I feel like when I've watched a Lars von Trier film, I have somehow, as the audience, been mocked. Whereas when I watch a Michael Haneke film, I feel like I've been taught a lesson.
Yes.
And not necessarily in a particularly nice way. But there's always something kind of elliptical or hidden in his films. I mean, fucking cachet means hidden. But they are films in which there are secrets which bubble underneath the surface of polite society, some of which may never be revealed in the course of the film. And Cachet is particularly challenging to the viewer because it features these incredibly long sequences in which nothing appears to be happening, but in which ordinary life is being surveilled. And you end up sort of going from sort of like anticipating what something's going to happen to sort of like slightly resigned boredom that nothing is, to then closely scrutinizing every single inch of the frame to see if something has changed, if there's been a clue as to what is going on. And I feel that there's a similar sort of thing going on in The White Ribbon as well, which is set just before the outbreak of World War One. And the film tells this very similarly sort of ambiguous tale about a troubled village in Germany. It's ruled over cruelly by a number of powerful men who perpetrate a large number of sort of secret abuses behind closed doors. And these things begin to get pushed into the light by a series of escalatingly brutal pranks, which sort of overthrow the order of things. And again, it's not quite clear who's responsible for this reign of terror, and yet it's somehow kind of working out or needling secret horrors that polite society wish to keep hidden. What did you make of The White Ribbon?
Oh God, The White Ribbon's so good. I mean, it's so full of dread. Again, I'm quoting Superhands for the second lock-in in a row. Powerful sense of dread. The longer the longer the note, the more the dread. But it really does have a powerful and pervasive sense of dread. It unfolds in kind of fragments that don't necessarily all coalesce or explain themselves. He does, in narration at the start, clarify that this is basically a movie about the generation of children who would become the Nazis. These are the people who would become those, and it is kind of about that. It is about the state of oppression and sexual repression, and secrets and lies and guilt and all that kind of heady stuff.
All his films seem to be about potentially children doing terrible things. Funny Games as well. You know, perverse. The kind of the perverse perpetrators of that are both young men. A cachet suspicion is thrown onto the son, the white ribbon. Are the kids in on it? You know, it's all about how you can keep things secret, but the impact of those things will nonetheless echo down the generations in terrible, terrible ways.
Yeah, he's I mean, he's kind of his last couple of films, I think. Um, there was one, the sort of flash mob one, whatever it was called. I thought was okay, but like he does seem to have kind of rested a little bit after making a series of unprecedentedly like intense movies. He seems to have calmed down a bit now. But I do love all three of those. Uh, yeah, he seems to suggest all his characters are always called Anna and Georges, the most common names in France. And he, even though he's Austrian, and he always wants to make a movie basically about the veneer of polite society that we put across, our simmering, violent, turbulent lives, and I think Cachet is probably the best out of those at kind of hinting at what's at the base of these horrible things without actually going out of its way to explain it. Yeah.
No easy solutions in any of these films.
No. And he's a very serious guy. I've seen him interviewed. He's an incredibly serious guy, which was why that Twitter account, that sort of Michael Haneke lol Twitter account, if anyone ever saw that, was very, very funny. Did you ever see that?
No.
It was very good in the early days of Twitter, someone pretending to be Michael Haneke, and it was all written in lol speak and stuff like that. It was very funny. So put that in the show notes, maybe. Your next one was Under the Skin, Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin.
Yeah, I mean, there is light and humor in this list, but not yet. Under the Skin is a genuinely harrowing film, the key points of which are easily and very widely spoiled, I would say. I managed to get to the cinema on the advisement of a friend who said, don't read anything about it. So I managed to get in and watch it. But I think even discovering the genre that it's in would spoil it to a degree. But I think it's suffice to say, the premise is that Scarlett Johansson plays a woman traveling around Scotland, luring men to a terrible, terrible fate. I don't really think you should know more about it than that. But I will. It's a horrendous film. Like, just the soundtrack of it is an oral nightmare. It's so bleak and shot through with sort of mundane misery, with something quite out of this world in its sinister scope. But it's also very memorable to me because I went to see it at a cinema which didn't have very good soundproofing, and during one of the kind of most climactic, traumatic scenes, the sort of umpar music from the Grand Budapest Hotel was pumping through the walls.
Yeah,
which is a crime for which I've never forgiven Wes Anderson, and that's one of the reasons none of his films appear on my list.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I'm glad there's none of his silly films here. It's funny, I knew the twists and turns in Under the Skin because I'd read the book. The book's amazing, actually. The book is also worth going into without knowing anything about it, because, but the book is much more conventional. So there was a conventional film to be made there, and the film reeks of a director and his editor going off the deep end and trying to redefine the language of cinema, right? It could have been so easily have been a disaster, I think. But it isn't. It manages to be wholly original in just about every conceivable way. Because the plot of the novel is quite straightforward, that, like I say, they could have done that. They could have made a very straightforward movie. And instead they wanted to use it as to try and make a movie that is anything but. And actually, I think the movie, once it finds a slightly more straightforward path, that's when it becomes a little bit weaker. I would agree with you that the soundtrack by Miike Levi, who is a bit of a genius herself, is absolutely incredible. Just inhuman sounding score that seems to come from somewhere else. Just fantastic.
Your next one was A Separation, which I have not seen.
Oh man, you got to see A Separation. What a movie. This is a movie from Iran, directed by Asghar Farhadi, from the end of last decade. It is a movie about a couple in Iran trying to obtain a divorce because the wife in the couple, who's a slightly more modern person, wants to kind of leave the country for reasons sort of unspecified, but kind of hinted at being about some of the political problems that were going on there at the time, and continue. And her husband, who wants to stay in the country to look after his infirm father, and they are trying to obtain a divorce, which in Iran isn't an easy thing to get. And neither of them want the divorce, really. It's just that they want different things in life at this moment. And so to get a divorce, they have to go through all these kind of legal loopholes, and they have to agree to it, and it has to be signed off like by the religious sort of leaders in where they are as well. What it is an extraordinarily human drama about people trying to work stuff out and kind of failing. It puts the individual at the forefront of this kind of, Iranian cinema is sort of famous really for kind of being unable to directly address the political problems that are faced by the people living there. So it does it in this movie, which is about people being separated from each other by ideology, by politics, by life, and manages to blend them all together into this, just a really human, sad, kind of perfect movie. Yeah, it's great. I can't recommend it highly enough.
I'll have to. Oh, I don't know where I can even access that, but I will.
It was nominated for an Oscar, so I think you can probably. I think it won an Oscar, in fact. So you can probably find that one.
I wanted to group the next two movies together, but in retrospect, I'm not quite sure why. I guess they're both beautiful, life-affirming films, and they both sort of operate on a sort of dizzying dream logic, I would say. The first one's The Great Beauty, which is a film by Paolo Sorrentino. It's about this sort of aging Italian socialite. I think he wrote like a book once, which was the fated in the literary world, and that's it. He's never done another thing since, except go to lots of parties in Rome. But like now it's his 65th birthday. He's tired of the nightlife. He's slept his way through the entirety of Italian society. But then like this sort of a shock from the past occurs, and it sort of makes him take stock and ultimately goes on this sort of like journey of self rediscovery in which he recognizes the great beauty of life. And the other film was Holy Motors, which is another sort of journey of discovery, although its implications are slightly less certain. During the course of like this single breathless night, we follow like a series of really hectic transformations of the central character, who may or may not be an actor inhabiting different roles, but he sort of plunges from one persona to the next without pause. It's just an incredibly frenetic film in which the surprises just keep on coming. At one point, there's like a full-on ensemble accordion rendition of "Let My Baby Ride," which just comes out of nowhere, and it's one of the best things I think I've ever seen or heard. Just dizzying films. Have you seen either of these?
I haven't seen The Great Beauty. I have seen Holy Motors, which I agree with you on is fantastic. That sequence, the intermission it's halfway through the movie, where with the sort of promenade accordion blues rock is, I agree, absolutely like so insanely exhilarating and amazing. And generally that movie has got some like a real sense of energy and verve to it. Like Kylie Minogue pops up at one point and sings, turns into a musical, which is kind of extraordinary. I thought Holy Motors it's great. I guess what I haven't seen The Great Beauty, from what I understand about it, it has that sense of just immense confidence in being entirely yourself. That kind of sense of being able to improvise almost your way through a world effortlessly, and that can be a sort of wonderful thing to experience as a viewer.
Yeah, it does feel like you've been on a wild ride by the end of it.
Absolutely. My next one is Captain Phillips by Paul Greengrass. If you work in television, and I work in television, you get lots of people who are very into Paul Greengrass movies, right? Because the sort of things he does with his like Bourne movies, especially, and kind of other stuff he's done, is make these like frenetically cinematic movies which really speak to people who are kind of interested in the craft of it, right? He's like an amazing editor. He does kind of extraordinary things with camera. I've always found, his movies kind of, especially his more like, the sort of Matt Damon-y stuff, a bit less interesting than I would like to. I think I always wanted to see more in them. But Captain Phillips, I think, is just an absolutely perfect articulation of everything he's about and everything that makes him great as a filmmaker. In that it is a geopolitical story about warring tribes. Those tribes being, the people who work on the oil tanker, including the titular Captain Phillips, played by Tom Hanks, the American military who sort of come in when things start to go tits up, and then the Somalians who come to the pirates who come to hijack the boat. And through its kind of convergence of these three forces, I think it tells a really quite exquisite kind of microcosm metaphor of now and of the kind of war between nations, the ideological difference and disparity between East and West. And it uses, Tom Hanks, who is this kind of, my dad always talks about how Tom Hanks is like the ultimate like personification of the military industrial complex. Like there's something about his persona which is kind of engenders that feeling, and I think Captain Phillips absolutely uses that in how they break this character down, who is this kind of picture of competence and uncomplicated masculinity. So Captain Phillips is just fantastic. The ending is devastating.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Paul Greengrass when he's doing some of his kind of more sober documentary films. I think he's better when he's boxed in with reality.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about Memories of Murder next, which is one of Bong Joon-ho's earlier films. You may know Bong Joon-ho for his film Parasite, which was well lauded at the Oscars recently. But I think Memories of Murder is his best film and probably the best serial killer film ever made. If that is a list that is that is acceptable to have. There's another serial killer film on this top 50 list, which we'll get to later, which I think is the second best. But Memories of Murder is the best. Set in South Korea, it follows this just hopelessly corrupt and inept police force as they attempt to really badly solve the case of South Korea's first reported serial killer. It follows it across the course of several decades and, the changing political climate. And I think what makes it an amazing film is that it's obviously in dialogue with the sort of the genres of serial killer films as they had appeared hitherto, but in a way which is quite typical of Bong Joon-ho's films and also some of the other filmmakers from his peerage in South Korea. It's a very sort of genre agnostic film. Right? It moves just completely fluidly from horror to slapstick comedy at times, drama, politics, and all these things just intermingle fluidly in this extraordinary, seamless fashion. Ultimately, making very sort of ambiguous film that sort of resists any moral judgments of its incredibly imperfect human cast of assholes. Basically, the police are not good police in this film, and yet you warm to them as you see them do karaoke, even as they beat suspects and trample evidence, even as they make such a hash of an important investigation. I haven't seen your next film, which is Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, but I think these two films probably share some sort of DNA.
Yes, it is about a car drive convoy through the night of the Turkish countryside to find a body. So at the start of the movie that this guy has been killed, and the person who killed him is is taking the police to find this body, where he's buried it somewhere in a shallow grave out in the sticks, basically. And it follows most of the movie. It's a long movie, follows the various police and local officials trying to find this body. It just, I'd never seen anything like it when I saw it at the cinema. And he's the director, Nuri, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Nuri Bilge-Ceylan has since gone on to make a whole bunch of movies which have, won lots of plaudits and awards. I haven't seen any of them yet, and I keep meaning to see stuff like Civil War, which everyone says is fantastic. But Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, it just takes you on a journey, and you get to know these people, and it has this great cast of like Turkish character actors, like big guys, like lots of men. It's an almost entirely male movie. And yeah, it felt like a weird form of tourism. I just felt like transported across the world to a bunch of people who, were very different from me in a certain kind of way, but were incredibly human. And yeah, it was just a really extraordinary experience watching that movie. Because it is a sort of anti-crime movie in a way. It's one of those movies that deals in the pointlessness of it, in the kind of, these are almost like bureaucrats trying to deal with an aberration in their notes. It's this kind of men on a job kind of vibe that, I just think is kind of fascinating. Yeah.
Your next pick was a film I hadn't heard of at all, Toni Erdmann.
Oh my God, Toni Erdmann. It's so good. A 3-hour-long comedy from Germany. It's absolutely bloody fantastic, Toni Erdmann. I think of all the films here on this list, this is one of my absolute favourites. It's a movie about a very, very difficult dad and his daughter, who is also difficult in her own way. He's difficult in that he puts in false teeth and dresses up in stupid costumes to make people laugh. He's like this impossible, embarrassing dad. And she is his uptight daughter who has a job with a kind of marketing company, who have been sort of sent to Eastern Europe to kind of carry out a project there. And what he does, the premise of the movie, is that he follows her there with a silly wig and a pair of false teeth, and kind of becomes this character, Toni Erdmann, who is, the idea is that he's going to kind of help her get her mojo back. So it has a kind of whackety schmackety romantic comedy, silly knockabout thing going into it. That's the premise. But actually what it is an incredibly rich exploration of East versus West, of the individual against the forces of politics, of selfishness, of imperialism. It manages to pack all of this stuff into this movie about being a bit of an uptight bitch and having an embarrassing dad. And yeah, I can't recommend it enough. It's incredible, and the central performances are all amazing, and the ending has to be seen to be believed. I mean, it has several endings. It goes on far too long. It's 3 hours, but all of them have to be seen to be believed, because it feels like a movie which is like the director going, "This is everything I think about everything." Blah, and yeah, amazing, brilliant movie. My friend, I watched it at home and had a break halfway through. My friend went to the cinema and saw it, and it ruined it for him because he was like, "It was too long. I needed a break."
Yeah. Yes, my bladder isn't up to 3 hours at this point in time, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I was a bit worried about picking my next film because it's sort of slightly. I mean, it's kind of willfully saccharine. It's Amélie, the film by Jean-Pierre Jeunet. And in light of your comment about Wes Anderson, I was also worried. But now that you've endorsed a wackety schmackety film, I feel slightly safer in picking Amélie, which is just a joyous film, a fable-like telling of this eccentric but incredibly good-hearted young woman. Borderline manic pixie dream girl, although most manic pixie dream girls are viewed externally with a male gaze, whereas this is very much her perspective, so it feels more allowable, even if she is, a confabulation of a male director. But I mean, she lives in Paris, or at least like this fantastic version of Paris, which is fringed and tinged by her surfeit of imagination. and she seeks kind of and ultimately finds love, whilst sort of improving the lives of everyone around her in mischievous ways. Um, and it's Jean-Pierre Jeunet is has a very particular style. I think it probably has influenced Wes Anderson in that there is a sort of willful unreality to it. The way that he tends to frame the narrative puts it at a sort of kind of distance where it's you're allowed to have a narrator, you're allowed to play with the frame of the narration. And it is a very playful film in every way, but it's just so warm-hearted and good. Just melts my heart, really.
Yeah, I think it's when I think with stuff like this, it's easy to sniff at something about like Amelie, but no, I don't mean that. What I mean is, it feels like the sort of thing you want to be annoyed with someone if they say one of their favorite movies is Amelie, but actually it's one of those films that when you see it. It's so sincere and heartfelt, and there isn't an ounce of insincerity in it that it just works. If there was, it wouldn't, and it would feel very cynical and weird. And films like this, or like the Hollywood version, what's that movie like? Pay It Forward, the Haley Joel Ultimate, like that kind of vibe, can often fall flat because they just feel they just feel insincere and pat and all that sort of stuff. Whereas Amelie just feels very inspired by real feelings and a real kind of joy about the world as well.
Yeah, there's a sort of artifice, I think, in a lot of the ways that Hollywood approaches kind of heartwarming films, in that they're designed in some way to be heartwarming. Whereas I feel like Amelie is just a story of somebody who's delighted, and willing to delight.
I wonder as well if Amelie was kind of part of the, because often like when a new indie movie's announced, right, and this was the model set by something like Little Miss Sunshine, like the way that they can market an indie movie is they will bring out a trailer and it'll probably have like Arcade Fire playing over it, and it will, the idea is it's going to be heartwarming, right? That is the USP of this like indie movie. It's going to warm your heart. And my feeling is always like, fuck off. I don't want my heart warmed by your, movie about a family coming together against the odds. Fuck off. So I think that, it kind of, ideally those movies would aspire to the kind of Amelies of this world. But I do think you do tend to get a lot of variations on the Little Miss Sunshine, yada, yada, yada.
Well, there's a streak of darkness, I think, in Jean-Pierre Jeunet's films as well. I mean, less identifiably in Amelie, although there is, various suggestions of malice in the background of it. But his one of the previous films of his was Delicatessen, which is a love story involving a cannibal butcher. And probably one of the most grotesque orgasm scenes in cinema history.
Yep.
So all of that sort of is
City
is
of
in
Lost
the background.
Children, sort of source of so many nightmares, that movie.
But I wanted to pair this with another French film, but this time an animation called The Triplets of Belleville. I think it was released as in the US anyway. I saw it as Belleville Rendezvous, which is a much better name, I think. But
yeah, that's my headcanon name for this movie. It's definitely Belleville Rendezvous. I hate that it's been retconned to The Triplets of Belleville.
Yeah, it's very inspired, I think, by Jean-Pierre Jeunet's films. It feels very fabulary in the same way. It's lively and bizarre. It follows this elderly French woman as the central protagonist who has this orthopedic shoe that she beats people with and this slobbery dog. And she goes on this very unlikely adventure to rescue her grandson, who is this mute professional cyclist with massive thighs, who gets kidnapped by criminals. I can't remember what the purpose of that is, but it's obviously something to do with the fact that he's very good at just riding a bike. And she gets aided in this by three vaudeville performing triplets. It's a very strange film which lurches off in all these different directions, but it's just incredibly heartwarming in a very uncynical way, but also with a streak of weirdness as well. I love both of those films. I haven't seen Triplets in a long time, so I should pick it up again.
One of the best dogs. The way that they will have the dog, the dog's dreams, because they live near a house. Their house is like near a railway, And the dog will often dream of like being on the train that goes past the window, round an enormous bowl of food, and all sorts of stuff like that. It's really amazing. A very like visually like striking movie as well. I still remember. I've only seen this movie like once, way back when, but I still remember the scene where they cross the ocean and the waves are done like these sort of skyscrapers. Really kind of unique art style. It's fantastic.
Your next film is easily the most obscure on this list, by a little-known indie series. Is it the Last Jedi? Am I saying that right?
Yes, I think there's an umlaut over the A, so it's the Lost. No, yes, Ryan Johnson's The Last Jedi. I kind of fell out of love with big budget filmmaking over the last sort of decade or so. For reasons we've already gone into, and seeing The Last Jedi was just fantastic. Obviously, Chris's sister did a fantastic pod that I would recommend to anyone wanting to hear some actual insight about those movies. But, someone says to Luke Skywalker in this movie, even now, looking at the horizon, and I thought that the movie did such a good job of kind of rounding up the story of Luke Skywalker, which for me was always the story of Star Wars, really. I didn't really care about anything else. When I was a little kid, I watched Star Wars, and the scene where Luke looks up at the twin sunset and the score swells, and he's this kid in this boring world who wants more from existence, and it kind of finishes off that story just beautifully in a way that I can't think of how you would improve upon it, because it is a Star Wars movie, which is the first Star Wars movie really since The Empire Strikes Back to actually engage with what a Star Wars movie would be, what a story would be that takes place in this world, because all of the other movies have been essentially remakes or retreads of the basic same concept. Whereas The Last Jedi is about, what about not, being the hero? What about not jumping in your spaceship and flying off towards the sunset every time something goes wrong? And I thought that was such a clever twist on it. It felt like a filmmaker feeling like this was his one chance to make a Star Wars movie. He better do a damn good job. And I think he really, really did. And I just found it so uplifting and exciting. After the kind of muted whatever of The Force Awakens, and then the kind of absolute shit show that was. But the thing is, the movie is complete. It has unlike a lot of the other big franchise movies, the movie tells a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and it takes a lot of time and effort to make sure that happens. And so it doesn't really matter because it exists perfectly well. In isolation from all the whatever is around it.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite of the three recent Star Wars films. I mean, that's not a hard choice, is it really? But I mean, I suppose I feel slightly embittered towards The Last Jedi simply because it sets up so many brilliant things that are really scintillating that then just get completely dropped by the third film. But you can't really blame Ryan Johnson for that.
It was a shame. I mean, it was a funny thing with the reaction to that movie, which has obviously been talked about a lot. But like, I remember, seeing there was quite a few of the cast members who were kind of a bit pissed off with how their characters ended up, and the kind of direction that the movies took. And it was this funny thing because for me, I was reading about Ryan Johnson, him saying that, he would write the story of The Last Jedi out, and he would keep writing out until he could fit it on one tiny page of his moleskin notebook, and that was how he knew he was ready to write the movie or ready to make the movie, is when he could fit the story onto one page. And it was like, it's an instinct to put the characters in service of a narrative that is kind of really missing from a lot of cinema, especially the franchise one, especially the superhero movies, because it doesn't make sense when you're dealing with properties to put them in the background or not have them have their moments of badassery. But he understands, I think, better than most, that it's not about, making sure that a character is serviced. That isn't the most important thing. It is about making a story that people can lose themselves in. And I think almost no one bothers to do that with a big budget these days. And so it was just absolutely spectacular to see him do it.
Do you think you can credit sort of the relationship that Kylo Ren has with Rey, which I think is one of the only those successful elements of the third film? Do you think you can sort of credit that success with what Rian Johnson did in the second film?
Yes, probably. I think it's certainly The Last Jedi does a lot of work in giving those characters a place to be. Because the first movie doesn't really. The first movie is such a mash of like, you know, Abrams puzzle box doodah. That the second movie has to do so much catching up, which ridiculously, of course, Abrams took as an affront to his own creativity. But still, like, it means that you have those characters delivered into a movie with a functioning backstory, for example, and a sense of character that isn't just a riff on something we've already seen.
I would like to talk about Park Chan-wook's two films, Thirst and Old Boy. These obviously sit together in my mind because they're by the same director. But I think they also, the things that are great about them both are shared between them to some extent. Thirst is the lesser known of these two films. And probably by far the better, I would say. It's this just absolutely insanely dark vampire horror drama comedy love story in the way that, like as with Bong Joon-ho's films and with many of Park Chan-wook's films, none of these films are exactly one thing. But this film is about this terminally ill Catholic priest who gets turned into a vampire as a result of a botched medical transfusion. Then he falls in love with somebody else's wife. And a lot of just incredibly comically neurotic bloodletting then ensues as he tries to kind of make peace with his new thirst and his Catholic faith and morality and all the rest of it, whilst also pursuing somebody who will become the love of his life, who ends up struggling herself with some of the same sorts of issues. It's just for a film that involves so much murder, it is an incredibly sweet love story. I don't think I've been as moved by a love story in a film as bleak as this in other ways, but bleak in a very funny way. Have you seen this film?
No, I always meant to. I always meant to see it because I always thought it looked great. But I'm grateful to you because you reminded me I need to get on this one.
Oh yeah,
I have seen your other movie, but I haven't seen this one. I have seen Old Boy.
Well, you see, Old Boy, I don't think it necessarily stacks up, but I feel like it sort of needs to be on this list because it has been so influential. Not least, I mean, it was obviously remade for Hollywood in a terrible Spike Lee film, but in the original, this sort of drunken, dissolute shithead salaryman is just abruptly kidnapped from his life for seemingly no reason and imprisoned in a hotel room for 15 years. At the end of which he suddenly escapes and punches a lot of people in a corridor. And then he tries to sort of unravel the reasons for his incarceration. And it sets up this sort of clockwork-like puzzle almost of why he's been incarcerated. That it's very sort of clever. I think it's a little too kind of arch in its construction. But again, it sort of seamlessly moves between absolutely brutal violence, drama, comedy, and romance in a way which I think when it sort of hit the scene, as it were, it was revelationary, I think. And in a way that I think a lot of South Korean films, when they arrived in the West, felt revelationary because a lot of the sort of the hitherto rules about how you deal with genre were just completely, utterly rewritten.
I remember coming out of this one and just being completely knocked out by it. You're absolutely right. I'd never seen anything like it. It was so, because I'd seen, Asian horror movies and stuff like that before, but this just seems so completely out on its own. And it has an ending which is, a hell of a lot of something, and I think it just, particularly at the time, it just felt like an absolute knockout. Shall I go on to my next one?
Yeah.
The Tale by Jennifer Fox. Now, this is not technically a movie because it was only released on TV. It
Oh.
was on HBO in America. It might have had a theatrical release somewhere,
Hmm.
but it's quite easy to find, or at least it was when I last checked. Anyway, The Tale, directed by Jennifer Fox. It is a movie about, and actually, just a content warning while I'm talking about this movie because it is about child abuse and rape. So skip forward a couple of minutes. I won't go into any detail, but just FYI, it is a movie based on the director's own experience of being a survivor of child abuse and how she reckons with that in her adult life and flashing back to when it happened to her as a child. Like I say, it's based on the director's own experience, so it's biographical, sort of down to a decimal point. Um, Laura Dern plays her, and then there's a young actress who's playing the younger version of her. The movie is about the tale referred to in the title is about the tale she has told herself to make herself okay with what happened to her, and how she's justified it in her head over the years as being something she was okay with, and how that has kind of calcified with time, but how that begins to unravel. I think it would be a very good movie for people to watch, to learn about this stuff. And I've heard that it's used for people, sort of treating people who have had these experiences, because it is very honest, it's very explicit, but it's also just very, very considered and heartfelt, and takes great pains to be accurate about an incredibly difficult subject. It has one moment early on which I think is just extraordinary. We're flashing back to when this girl was a 13-year-old, and when you see her, and you'll have to take with what I'm saying with a grain of salt because it'll make me sound a bit weird, but when you see her, you think, oh, well, that's not so bad. She looks kind of, she's on her way to womanhood. She looks okay, and this is the version of herself that Laura Dern is remembering. And you're sort of seeing her interact with these people. And then what happens was her mother says to her, sees a picture of her at that age, and says, "Oh no, that was you when you were 15. This is you when you were 13," and shows her a picture of a little girl, very much a little girl. And the actress in the flashback changes into a little girl, and you realise that that you've been kind of tricked by the casting almost of her own memories, which is just this perfect way of explaining how, getting into the idea that that she's told herself a different version of events to what actually happened. A sort of moment of magic, really, of horrible magic. So yeah, it's a harrowing watch. And
Yeah.
the first thing that happens in it is a thing comes up on the screen saying there are scenes of child abuse in this movie, and tells you how they were shot with body doubles and stuff like that, because it is a lot. But I found it insanely powerful, and I felt like I learned so much about such an awful thing that seems so common in our world. Yeah.
Well, I think I'll have to fortify myself before I watch that, I have to say. But how about some light relief? A film about the 1981 IRA hunger strike. Yeah, Steve McQueen, I think, is one of the most exciting filmmakers on the planet currently. He won a lot of plaudits for 12 Years a Slave, which, whilst it tells like a very important story, I think is actually kind of a slightly less interesting film in some ways than Hunger and also Shame, both of which I put on this list. Hunger, like I said, about the IRA hunger strikes in the 1980s in Mays prison. Led by the prisoner whose name became famous after that, Bobby Sands, here played by Michael Fassbender, who's they're protesting against their treatment, specifically also their treatment as non-political prisoners. They wish to be recognized as political prisoners. But actually, the film's sort of less about the wider ambitions of the Republican cause. In fact, it does do some things to complicate that. And make it clear that that's not just an unalloyed cause for good and nobility, but it's more about sort of the personal lengths someone will go for a belief. And this is typified in the film's best scene, and probably one of the best scenes in cinema, by this just utterly riveting 17-minute long single shot debate between a priest played by Liam Cunningham and Michael Fassbender, as they sort of talk about the purpose of his sacrifice, and the priest attempts to kind of talk him out of it, talk him out of starving himself to death. And it's an amazing conversation to watch. It's absolutely riveting. But it was interesting in relation specifically to your watch of Midnight Mass, because as I was watching Midnight Mass, I was like, "Oh, holy shit! This the conversation that the priest has in that one-on-one, a very extended conversation with one of the other kind of focal point characters in that TV series. Although it's obviously talking about a much sort of more trivial, fantastic, if you like, sort of situation. But but I felt it sort of echoed this debate in a lot of ways. It's a sort of a meeting of minds intent on persuading each other. It's brilliant. And shame, I can't remember whether this film came out before or after Hunger, but
it was after.
The Fassbender sort of returns again, and again, it's another film about the effects of need on the body and mind, in as much as he plays a sex addict in this, and then his sister, played by Carey Mulligan, who crashes his flat, is just as destructive in a bunch of other ways, and the film is sort of like this fairly unhappy examination of the ways in which they are just grimly unable to seek relationships that would sustain them or nourish them, and it's shot with this sort of bleak modern sterility that feels quite a lot like Michael Mann films. Both of these films are just perfectly put together. Like, obviously, not a single shot has gone wrong or has been. There's none of it feels improvisational or catching up. They are exquisitely made films. I think Steve McQueen's films, incredibly handsome and solid in a way.
I remember the first I ever saw of Steve McQueen was when he won the Turner Prize. I think he won it for the series of movies, which was him recreating the Buster Keaton stunt where the sort of facade of houses would fall down over him, and he would kind of the window would kind of land over him, so he would be protected from anything crushing him. And he did a series of those, and I think that's what he won the Turner Prize for. And I always think it was such an interesting sort of thematic for him to set, that like our bodies are these kind of vulnerable things in space, but they're kind of all we have. That the sense of solidity that we have of our own bodies is our only sense of solidity in a world that is constantly trying to kind of fuck us over in one sense or another. And I think that carries into their 12 Years a Slave as well.
Yeah.
I think he's a really fascinating filmmaker who never does anything the easy way. He always takes an unusual choice. The Arbor, Cleo Barnard. Have you seen this movie, Marsh?
I haven't, no.
So this might be an even more brutal and sad and depressing movie than The Tale, I think. It is a documentary, a mix of documentary and fictional elements, that tells the story of Andrea Dunbar, who is the playwright who wrote Rita Sue and Bob 2 and a number of other plays before dying at a young age. She's a working class woman from Bradford who grew up in pretty extreme poverty, who kind of became this sort of cause célèbre for her kind of amazing scripts plays she wrote that were put on, which have these kind of extraordinary, view of a world that's not normally touched by theatre. And then in this movie, what Cleo Barnard does is kind of tell her stories. And what she did was interview the major players in her life. But then what she does is get actors to lip sync to the recordings of people talking about it. As well as sort of recreations of some of Andrea Dunbar's plays in the sort of out in Bradford, like out on the estate where she grew up. Her life story is extraordinarily sad and brutal. She lived far too short a life and was treated very badly. But actually, the movie is more interested in her two children, who kind of went off in very different directions, but their story have real bleakness and darkness to them too. yeah, it's a movie you need to go into sober, because there are some real horrors therein. But it is also, I think, a really quite extraordinarily moving movie about, again, another kind of movie about a world where you just kind of, there's not that many voices from these spaces that gets through, or there's precious little. And I think it feels like almost like a privilege watching that movie to kind of hear from a world where, no one really, especially in this day and age, no one really gives a fuck about working class people from Bradford, So, yeah, really good one.
Wow, that sounds fucking grim.
Yeah.
Well, I think the sort of next two picks are slightly more uplifting. They're both by Pedro Almodóvar, who's a filmmaker I came to actually through the first of these two picks, Volver. And I think that gave me a sort of misaligned expectation of what his films are generally like, because he is incredibly in love with schlock and camp, and his films tend to be extremely histrionic and bizarre and funny. But Volver is actually not like that. It feels kind of much more kind of meaty and sumptuous. It's just this incredibly rich, heartwarming, and very funny drama about a family of Spanish women, uh, in which Penelope Cruz is forced to kill her husband after he attempts to rape her daughter, which doesn't sound like it's going to be the setup for a heartwarming film, but it really is. And this horror initiates a sequence of events which sort of uncovers further secrets from previous generations. I feel like I'd eaten a big meal when I came out of this film. Just incredibly satisfied in every single way. I felt quite similar about Talk to Her as well, which is the Pedro Almodóvar film that you picked.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. This movie, it's it's a story of I mean, it's weird. It's one of those movies that starts off as a completely different movie before heading in a different direction. About a guy married to a woman who's a bullfighter, and the first half hour of the movie is about that, and then she gets injured, and then the movie is about who he meets in the hospital that she is sent to. I was I was sort of after I put this on our list, I was thinking about it because Talk to Her is kind of a movie, and I don't want to spoil it because I do think it is worth a watch. But it is a movie that has things to say about loneliness, and I think he said that the alternative title for the movie is Loneliness. But the way that it kind of articulates and the way that the story goes is kind of outrageous and upsetting in many ways. Um, Suffice to say that this is a movie about people imprinting on the bodies of comatose young women emotionally, falling in love with them, and where that takes them. And I found with the movie that it was so beautiful and troubling, is what I would say about that movie. And it kind of embraces that, and that is why I can't. You can almost imagine condemning that movie for where it takes you, and for the sort of some of the moral choices that the characters made. But the film embraces that trouble and that sense of unease with such a sort of sense of humanity to come alongside it, that for me, I found it extraordinarily moving when I watched it. Although I also found myself feeling very uneasy about it too. I think it might be a masterpiece, but it is also completely outrageous in so many ways. Yeah.
I think that is Pedro Almodóvar's sort of niche, isn't it? Is outrageousness, I think.
Yes. Gozu. Have you seen Gozu by any chance, Marsh?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's one of a million films by Takashi Miike, since he seems to put out at least 10 a year.
Yeah.
But I haven't
So,
seen Gozu.
so Gozu is basically his take on a David Lynch movie. So it is a movie about a guy who is, I think the basic plot is about, a young Yakuza taking an older, crazier Yakuza somewhere to be, I think maybe to be whacked, or maybe that turns up as a plot element later. It doesn't really matter, because what basically happens in the movie is they arrive in a small, weird town somewhere in Japan, and weird shit starts happening. and it doesn't make sense. It kind of characters transform from one to another. It's got some absolutely horrendous Miike style body horror with sort of gallons of breast milk and worse.
Oh my god.
And an amazing scene where a guy is being French kissed by a cow. It's so mad. It's an absolutely insane and wild ride that I really, really recommend. It is bonkers, disgusting, hilarious, kind of powerful in its own way. It's got an absolute hair raiser of an ending. And yeah, it just feels like just from someplace else. It's written actually by, if you ever see Kill Bill, the sequence in Kill Bill where they're in the house of Lucy Liu's kind of domain, and she's got this little guy who's kind of following her around. They call him Charlie Brown, and they're all taking the piss out of him. It's written by that guy for some reason. The bald guy who's sort of following around and being bossed around by his wife in Kill Bill. It's written by him, and he turns up in it as well as a guy selling custard. Yeah, it's mad. The DVD I've got of it, which I can actually see from here, it just says, the quote on the box is from a critic, just says, "Brace yourself," which I think is an excellent. But yeah, no, Gozu, completely insane, really good fun. I can't recommend it enough, actually.
Wow, I dream of getting that kind of box quote for anything I've ever made.
So, not two movies, just one movie by Luca I can't pronounce his name.
Guadagnino? I don't know how to pronounce his name. Call Me By Your Name is the name of the film that we wanted to talk about next. It's set in 1983. And it's about this precociously talented 17-year-old played by Timothée Chalamet, who's the son of this Italian archaeology professor who finds himself drawn to an older graduate student played by Armie Hammer, who's staying at their idyllic villa for the summer. And they sort of tentatively embark on this love affair. I kind of typically dislike coming-of-age dramas generally, but this one is sort of like so shorn of the usual sort of crude social anxieties and embarrassment that it sort of seem to be part of that package normally. And it's instead a film about just emotional growth, self-realization, sort of transitory nature of this sort of summer love. It's really an deeply beautiful film, incredibly moving, with tremendous performances. Have you seen it?
Yes. Now, this is the one movie I would say I disagree with you on. I did not like Call Me By Your Name. I loved his movie one or two before then called I Am Love with Tilda Swinton, which is a really good, not entirely dissimilar because it's about a sort of family in Italy, but I think is a bit more to my taste. Call Me By Your Name, why didn't I like it? It was mostly, to be honest, the finals. I can't spoil it, but there's a scene at the end where there is a father-son conversation between Timothée Chalamet and Michael Stahlberg. I never know how to pronounce that guy's name. That guy, he's going to come up in another film later on. I genuinely think is one of the best actors in the world. But his face in that scene annoys me so much because he's being so earnest, and it just felt so silly that I walked out of that movie thinking, "Fuck that movie."
Wow,
that guy's face ruined that movie.
Oh wow, I don't recall his expression at that point, or what could have been so annoying about it. I'll take your word for it, though. But I wanted to discuss that in the context of the next film, which is Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I mean, both it's in a very reductive way. Both of these films are about gay love affairs, which have a ticking time clock element to them. But Portrait of a Lady on Fire, another in a period setting, but this one sort of feels a lot kind of moodier and less settled than the sort of idyllic summertime of Call Me By Your Name. It's about Marianne, a painter who's summoned to this isolated estate on the Brittany coast, and she's there to secretly paint a portrait of a young aristocratic lady who's going to get married, and so this portrait is an important part of her betrothal. But the lady in question does not want to be married, and and refuses to have her portrait painted. So the painter is there in sort of pretending to be a hired companion, but is secretly sort of taking sketches and creating this painting of her. But then this deception is put under duress as a relationship between the two women develops. I think both of these films just the transitory nature or the kind of almost impossible nature of the love that is blossoming is just exquisitely beautiful and tragic and painful at the same time. Gorgeous looking films as well.
Yes, I would say that my favourite bit in Call Me By Your Name is the bit when they go on the day trip into town and there's the girl standing by the car dancing to the Psychedelic Furs, and Armie Hammer goes and dances with her, and Timothée Chalamet sort of watches, which is clearly something that actually happened to, I think, the director. And it just, for me, that was the best and most beautiful moment in the movie because it felt so true to that, exactly what you're saying, that kind of youthful transitory moment, kind of feeling like this is the best anything's ever going to be, and then it's all going to fade away. And yeah, I think I haven't seen a Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but it is definitely on my list. Amores Perros by Alejandro Gonzalo Inarritu. I never know how to pronounce his last name. It's a running theme here. Loves a bitch is the English translation. Yeah, this is. I think this film came out in 2000, so it's quite close to.
I was surprised to hear this was this side of the millennium, actually, because I remember it being like a big, impactful film in my teenage years. But clearly, that's a false memory.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a kind of, it has a sort of Tarantino style structure where it's sort of 3 or possibly 4 stories that all kind of collide quite literally in a car crash, all unified by the theme of dogs in Mexico City, turn of the century Mexico City. Again, it's one of those movies which is just so packed with humanity and a sense of the real world as this kind of big chaotic place where human moments are few and far between and so valuable when they're found. Yeah, I mean, one of the stories is about a kind of pretty actress who's having an affair with a married man, who then loses her dog under the floorboards of her house, her new flashy house, and it is a kind of study in guilt. And then there's kind of various other stories coming in there. There's one moment which anyone who's seen the movie will know, which is the moment when the tramp guy gets back to his sort of house and what he finds there, which I think is up there with one of the most jaw-dropping moments in any of the movies on this list. It's a movie about people and a movie about dogs and kind of how dogs become a sort of vessel for people's own inadequacies, and I think it has a really amazing script as well. Yeah, it's just really great.
Yeah, it's got a terrific sense of pace to it as well. And I introduced Gael Garcia Bernal to me, who is objectively one of the most beautiful people. I think.
God, he is absolutely, particularly in that movie. Actually, he almost seems to sort of shine, light emanating from him. He's so perfect.
But he's a piece of shit as well, really. I think that's the thing. It's quite a clever bit of casting because he is so kind of angelic looking that I think had they cast anybody else, his character would have landed in a much more unsympathetic way from the outset. But you are with him for most of it because he is just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Fish Tank was my next film, which actually, as you were talking about the unloved working classes for the Arbor, made me think of Fish Tank as well. Actually, although when I was looking up Fish Tank again to remind myself of what even happens in it, it is so grim that I was like, what am I doing? Why don't I put something nicer on the list than this?
Yeah.
It's a really unrelentingly grim kitchen sink stuff with no real life affirming or redemptive qualities. We follow this unruly teenager, Mia, who's played by Katie Jarvis. So I'm now pleased to see has had an acting career after this. She was like just a completely unstudied off the street
That's right.
actor, I
Yeah.
believe, at the time, and then didn't appear in anything for a decade or so. But now has been regular on EastEnders, so she's got back in the saddle in that respect. But this teenager Mia, her life in this East London council estate is pretty turbulent. She has these beefs with her ex best friend, and entertains sort of adolescent notions of being a dancer, which, if as you're watching it, you realize probably isn't going to be in her future. She commits these minor crimes, and essentially she finds herself drawn to her mother's charming middle class boyfriend, played by Michael Fassbender again, who reciprocates this attraction in a much more predatory fashion, and made it very difficult for me to like Michael
Yeah.
Fassbender in films thereafter. I don't know that the film sets out to say anything itself. It is just this sort of slice of bleak life.
Yeah, I mean, another movie occurred to me as you were talking then, which is the movie I would recommend it actually. Again, it's kind of heavy going. Is Samantha Morton's single directorial movie, which is The Unloved, which is about based on her own experiences of growing up in care, and is absolutely heartbreaking and very very sad. But again, is as a piece of social realism and a kind of real sense of reality. Truth. I think it's of a piece with Andrea Arnold's work as well. St. Maud. Have you seen St. Maud?
No, is this the only out and out genre thing we have on our list?
Yeah, I think so. There's probably a couple more horror. There's maybe one more horror movie from me a little bit further down.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, St. Maud. So this is a recent movie. It came out a couple of years ago. It is. I just want to shout out the director. Directed by Rose Glass and starring someone called Morfydd Clark. It is the story of a young woman who has been, at some point in the past, a medical student or a nursing student who has been sort of struck off from that for reasons unknown, and who goes to work for a old retired actress who's dying, played by Jennifer Ale. And it is about her kind of. It is about her relationship with her and her own sense of herself as sort of holy or sacred, and basically where that takes her. And I don't want to sort of say any more about the plot because it is a kind of real sort of road to hell, that movie, about where it goes. It's just a really interesting movie, really well directed. The performances are fantastic. It's a young female director doing it, and it feels like it comes from a different place. It's set in Wales, in the seaside. You again with that feeling of being in a different world, but just a very sad and true story, which is kind of a horror movie, but is very human focused, I think. And yeah, it's just one of those movies that's just completely unique. It's completely itself. You've never seen anything like it, and yeah, really, really good. I really recommend that one, actually, St. Maud.
Our next film was Nightwatching, which seems to have largely flown on the radar when I talk to people. A film by Peter Greenaway. It's mostly about the painting of Rembrandt's most famous picture. It's like this ensemble portrait called The Night Watch, which I think hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And it was commissioned by the people who appear in the picture, who are this sort of influential group of militiamen. But the film posits that Rembrandt, in fact, sort of took this commission under some duress because he didn't like the people. And in fact, he suspected them of murder. And he uses symbology that apparently would have been readily understood at the time, but is incomprehensible to modern audiences, to subtly accuse those people in the picture of that murder. And there's an accompanying documentary that Greenaway put out, which sort of set this out in more scholarly terms. I don't think the scholarly world has been convinced that this is the case. And in fact, I think in a kind of extra clever way, it may in fact be Peter Greenaway's sort of like making an extra sort of artistic confabulation on top of the movie itself, which is sort of interesting to think about. Like, he's created this separate reality, which he's then bolstered by a documentary, which might be fallacious, but then it kind of supports the fiction of this other film. If that is his intention, and he's not just a conspiracy theorist, then there is a really kind of interesting and intricate artistic attempt going on there in some way, even if it sort of ultimately sort of creates disinformation about Rembrandt's most famous work. But aside from all that, like, the movie Beneath is also this just incredibly humane and like bawdy look at Rembrandt's life. Martin Freeman plays Rembrandt, and it's just a superb performance from him. You get to see his penis, which is fun, and then but one of the things I really like about it is that it's obviously made by somebody who really loves Rembrandt's paintings, not just because the way that the stage is set, and a lot of Peter Greenaway's films take place in what feels like an artificial space, kind of very, very stagey in the way that they're put together. But this one is stagey, but it's also composed like Rembrandt's paintings. The use of light, the composition feels like paintings of that era, and not only that, but the kind of quality with which they appraise Rembrandt's life is also very much like that same sort of rich but completely unembarrassed interest with which Rembrandt himself depicted the what would be thought of as squalid lives of other people, but he did it with compassion. And showed them to be humans, despite living lives of poverty in comparison to the people who normally pay for paintings. I think it's quite a deeply empathic film, and quite beautiful as well.
It sounds fascinating. He's one of my complete blank spots. I don't think I've ever seen a Peter Greenaway movie, so I definitely need to remedy that one. A Serious Man by the Coen brothers. I'm glad that this is one of the ones we agreed on, because obviously there's a bunch of Coen brothers movies released in the last 20 years, and probably quite a few of them are more highly considered than A Serious Man. But I think it's their best movie, perhaps, maybe their best movie in the last couple of decades. The story of the kind of existential crisis a guy goes through after he finds out his wife is trying to divorce him. It's very weird. It's set in sort of Minneapolis in the 1960s amongst a sort of Jewish community, which is the one that the Coen brothers kind of come from themselves. And it's kind of it has a lot of fun with sort of some of the foibles and idiosyncrasies of that world. For me, one of the reasons I love it is it has one of the great villains ever, Cy Abelman.
Oh, yes.
Who is just this incredible... I just think he's one of the truest villains you've ever seen, because he rocks up at the house with a bottle of wine and tells Michael Stuhlbarg that he's basically going to steal his wife from him, and there's nothing he can do about it. And he keeps hugging him and embracing him. And yeah, it just felt so true to me that is how the villains in your life turn up, really. They don't turn up in the shadows. They turn up at your door with a bottle of Manischewitz wine. So I just love A Serious Man. It's about existence and the absurdity of existence. I love that Richard Kind, his brother, the character he plays, is like writing a kind of like geometry of space-time or something in a book. He's kind of writing it's a great movie, I think, with another spectacular ending.
It's a very funny film, but I think it's also the Coen brothers' most sort of self-satirizing to some extent. I think I've talked to you about this in chat before, but sort of one of the problems I have with the Coen brothers is that they're very liberal with their use of fate as a device, and terrible circumstances befall their protagonists often, and the films seem to be saying, "Wow, isn't this bad? How terrible it is!" But like, you can't escape the fact that it has been written to be bad for these people. Like, the hand of the director is very evident to me in the way that fate falls out in these things, and I feel like it's a little bit perverse often for the Coen brothers to try and tug at your sympathies for people who they have themselves put in this punishing situation. There's just something a bit too kind of arch and wry about it. Whereas in this film, which is just a relentless sequence of terribly shitty things happening to the main character, which seem extraordinary, there just seems to be a level of humor and self understanding.
I love the scene where he's talking to his student, the one who may or may not be blackmailing him, and he's talking to him about Schrodinger's cat, and the student saying to him, because he's the student's not doing well enough in his classes and not, handing in his papers properly. And the student's known, like, the thing is, I understand about the cat. I get the cat. I understand about the cat. And he's sort of saying it's not about the cat is just a metaphor. It's about the maths. It's about the work you have to do behind that. And I thought that was quite a good little key to unlock that movie. Like this kind of idea that you can give yourself a little cute model, but unless you understand the numbers behind it, you're just talking bollocks about a cat,
The next two films I wanted to pick up were both David Fincher films. Obviously, one of the kind of the big names of the last 2 decades. The two films that I wanted to pick by him were The Social Network and Zodiac, which are two incredibly different sort of films. The Social Network is, this incredibly pithily, zippily scripted film written by Aaron Sorkin, which tells the story of Facebook's founding and the subsequent falling out of its founders. And I guess it must be the first and possibly, is it the only now major dramatic film to examine like an institution of that scale, which has dominated and ruined our society. I don't think. I doubt that at the time that Fincher put it together, he probably realized quite the importance. I mean, Facebook was a big deal, obviously, but I doubt he realized quite the importance of the subject matter at the time. And as a result of that, it allows Fincher to tell a kind of more personal story about these flawed, incredibly vain young men in a scrabble for dominance and prominence in this new frontier of Silicon Valley. But I think it lets them off the hook a little bit for what is now apparent as a crime against humanity.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a film that's going to be looked back on in decades, I think, as Facebook's influence in the world continues to destroy it.
One of the if you ever listen to the podcast Behind the Bastards, which is a very good take on awful people, with a very talented journalist who presents it, Robert Evans, and he talked about how the thing is with those movies is that Mark Zuckerberg has used the myth created of him in The Social Network to kind of disguise the fact that he's actually much worse than that. He's a much worse person and always was, and has always been a selfish guy who just basically has worked out the algorithm to make as much money as possible and give himself as much power as possible, really at the expense of anything else. I mean, the movie touches on that, but I think Mark Zuckerberg has enjoyed a level of sort of immunity because of it, because there's a sort of fictional version that people can look at.
Absolutely. I mean, Jesse Eisenberg is incredibly charismatic, even as he's being a prick in this film. But he's smart, he's witty, and he's incredibly damaged and needy. But the film does. There's even a line in it which says, "You're not such a bad guy, Mark. You just, I can't remember what excuse they give him, but but it's clearly not the out and out sociopathy that actually typifies much of Silicon Valley."
No, absolutely not.
But Zodiac, in a way, these films didn't really need to be linked together, did they? Because they share almost nothing between them, I think, apart from the director.
Obsession.
Oh, okay. Yeah, fair. Okay. We'll work with that. But yeah, Zodiac is obsessional. I think, Fincher himself has some level of obsession with serial killers. That is a recurring theme in his own work, from Seven to the TV series he did, Mindhunter. But this is just a forensic, methodical, dramatic retelling of the search for the Zodiac killer across many decades, and the things that the search does to the lives of those people involved. I think it's just I really admire films that take essentially a documentary subject and then unpack it in a way which is both dramatically exhilarating and exhaustive. I think that's a difficult thing to do, and this is one of those films that does that brilliantly. It's a great exploration of the investigation, which just has so many dozens of bizarre coincidences and blind eyes and twists in it that if you wrote it as fiction, you'd just be like, oh, that's fucking ridiculous. But it actually happened.
Yeah.
But also on top of that, the film is obviously in dialogue with and references, and I think to some sort of degree kind of repudiates the sort of seedy schlock of serial killer films as a broader genre, and even sort of replies to Fincher's own effort in Seven, with kind of the appropriate sobriety now for dealing with something which is actually, irredeemably tragic for the victims.
Yes. It's a nicely asymmetrical movie as well. Like, it's nicely, it's sort of weird and bulbous and weird diversions. That's always nice to see. They try and kind of unavoidable if you're going to actually try and take on the totality of something rather than the easiest narrative route through.
Yeah, I really like Gyllenhaal in it as well, which I don't often in films.
Yeah, I quite like Gyllenhaal. Is Downey Jr. in it as well? Has I got that right?
Yeah, he's great.
Some really interesting kind of performances because he's kind of mostly disappeared into the iron suit now, hasn't he? But you always forget that he was capable of like pretty extraordinary stuff that wasn't being Tony Stark. Anyway.
Well, he is kind of Tony Stark in this film.
Yeah, he is.
He's still a wisecracking smart.
The wisecracking super cop. Yeah. But yeah, Whiplash by Damien Chazelle. So I've only seen this movie once. I will not be watching this movie again because the experience I had watching it was so good that I don't want to ever go back to it and potentially spoil that. I saw it at the cinema, and it felt like being an ingredient in and also the object of a magic spell, basically. It's a movie that builds itself around a character's drive towards perfection, and how he's kind of tempted in and out of this by a devil figure. But what it really felt like for me, it was a movie that delivers you into a final scene, kind of explodes your brain with euphoria, and then kind of kicks you up the backside to get you out of the cinema. I was so excited and appalled by it, and particularly by that final scene. I remember when the final, the film ends on a drum hit, and I remember I literally shouted "Blimey!" at the screen, which is ridiculous. And everyone looked at me and laughed, but I had been completely taken to pieces by it. And kind of, just the way it was able to induce euphoria in me in that final sequence was really unreal and strange. I rang up my sister on the way out of the cinema, being like, "I just saw a really amazing movie." And just her like on the end of the phone, like, no idea what I'm talking about. Just like, okay, you saw a good movie, did you? Like, oh, kind of all over the shop. But that was just so fantastic. I haven't liked anything he's done since.
Oh, really? I don't think I've seen anything else by him. But that is a searing film. I think what I like about it is how much it annoyed people. who came out thinking that it needed to be didactic. Because I mean, there's a sense in which this film could be misinterpreted as promoting suffering as the means to achieve good art, and that's not necessarily the case. But I don't think the film is saying that that's how things have to happen. This is just the way that things happened in this circumstance, and that this is a complicated relationship. And there's terrible abuses that happen between teacher and student in this film, but it's not necessarily good that achieves an enhancement of talent in the student. That it's I don't think it's coming up with any answers. It's saying this is a difficult situation.
Yeah, it kind of. I mean, in a certain like, it's a kind of fascistic movie, but not necessarily one that's kind of condoning that. It's just, it kind of gives you this case study in it, I guess, rather than like saying this is great. Because you're watching that movie and you're having a great time in that ending sequence, but the film doesn't let you get away with it. It's not like the film goes, wow, if we all just applied ourselves really hard, we'd all be free. It's like you make a deal with the devil and you suffer, and it's not always great. It's just kind of like you might have a great moment, but it's transitory.
Right. Well, and what happens after the close of that film? I mean, lots of things are still fucked up, right? I mean, it's not.
He's divested himself of his entire life, so it's like,
Talking of whiplashes, the next film is Paddington, uh, which
Also
is
a fascist movie.
it's just an unbelievably witty and joyous film about a talking bear from deepest Peru who travels to London, and he gets adopted by this family, and he's just exceedingly nice to everyone, even when Nicole Kidman's trying to fucking taxidermy him. It's just incredibly warm-hearted, very funny, and I think it just didn't need to be. I think it could have been easily a much, much worse film, but they put out the best version that it could possibly be. And people say that they like Paddington 2 better. I didn't particularly, but even if that was the case, I think that Paddington just is such a, it's absurd for me to call it brave. I'm going to call it brave. It's a brave bit of filmmaking because it could have been just a cheap, low-hanging fruit kids film, and it actually swung for the bleachers. What a fucking mix of terrible metaphors that is, but it's good.
It's all good. My next movie, from a bear found at Paddington Station to the catastrophic stocking of the Lake Victoria in Africa with a certain kind of perch. Darwin's Nightmare, directed by Hubert Soper. I'd really recommend this movie. It's great. It is about
this is definitely the film of yours which I'm most excited to see, I have to say, because I love logistical fish-based catastrophes.
Of course you do. So this is a documentary about Lake Victoria in Africa. It was stocked as a sort of bit of engineering with a certain kind of fish, which it was hoped would re-energize the local economy. Which it kind of did briefly, but with terrible, terrible side effects and results. It's a really interesting documentary because it takes a very hands-off approach to the kind of filmmaking aspect. It's mostly composed of long shots and long interviews, and the camera really sort of sits back and watches and takes in these characters who have kind of come to this basically hellhole created by the West. It's another movie, very much about the kind of disparity between, the developing world and the first world. Very, very sad and very, very disturbing, but also kind of fascinating. The characters that have descended on this place. You get to know them with a real human touch. I mean, a lot of it is about the sex workers who have been drawn to the area by the influx in money, but also the weirdo mercenaries who've come over from Britain to be weird and menacing. It's a whole strange cast of characters. Really fascinating, unique movie. He made another movie a few years later, which is much more. It's funny because when you see him in the other movie he made, he's this incredibly charismatic Frenchman who is fantastic on camera. But in Darwin's Nightmare, you don't see a hide or hair of him. So I thought that was quite interesting. But both of his movies, I can't remember what the other one's called, are really worth a watch because they are an investigation into something going very badly wrong that is entirely man-made. Yeah, unavoidable.
Wow, that sounds brilliant. Weirdly, it has a bit of sort of mirroring of the film I want to talk about next, but its position in this list is just happenstance.
Yes.
But Bitter Lake, another documentary, this one by Adam Curtis. Adam Curtis has this sort of unique ability to pull together disparate strands from history and culture and weave them into a single coherent thread. I think sometimes the coherency of that thread is perhaps illusory and just down to the skill of Adam Curtis as a filmmaker, but he's nevertheless very convincing whilst you're watching the films. And here he's looking at the sort of historical context and the reasons for and the fallout of the Afghan war. But at the same time, he's doing just so much more in the margins, with parts of this film just talking about us as humans, the intermixture of cultures, the interaction of our politics and power and media. And he does this by mining the BBC archives for just never before seen B-roll, essentially, from a billion different news reports. And he conjures and blends these images of incredibly powerful metaphoric resonance from this sort of offcuts. And Bitter Lake is sort of revelatory, I think, in the ways that talks about the larger kind of historic themes, but also it's moment to moment just full of beautiful juxtapositions and images. I think one of the there's just a interesting sequence of images where it's this protracted shot of, I assume, Afghani men doing some sort of dance, which to Western eyes might read as sort of effeminate. It's lots of pirouetting involved, and then it cuts to video footage of a bunch of American GIs getting manicures. And it's just, it's full of these. I mean, you can't help but think immediately, whatever you thought of the dancing Afghan men, the next sequence of images just completely undermine, or just expose that your own view of masculinity is obviously completely constructed by your culture. There's just another brilliant shot of, I think in fact, in part of that sequence, then it kind of, after it's gone through the GIs having their fingernails painted, it cuts to this little statuette of a dancing hula lady, just one of these kind of wind-up toys, and like it's just in the center of the camera, this little wind-up toy doing this little hula dance, and all these kind of Afghan kids looking at it in sort of like mesmerization. And again, what does that say about the construction of femininity, of sexuality and dancing and all these other things? And then just right at the end, this little hand reaches out from the side of the screen and snatches it, and then it cuts and goes on with the documentary. But it's just full of those beautiful little moments, which are, I think, incredibly telling.
I found it a lot more convincing than a lot of his recent work. Like, I thought The Power of Nightmares, which probably is a masterpiece, back in the day, was really good. But then his subsequent movies, and actually the stuff he's done since Bitter Lake, I think veers pretty dangerously into conspiracy theory and, like you say, just like clever filmmaking to sort of make a point. I think Bitter Lake is really good because it embraces space and ambiguity a bit more. It's 3 hours long, and a lot of that is him using long shots, as you say, of like archive footage and stuff like that. And I think for me, that solves a lot of that. This is the story of a man who thought he could change the world with an idea, doing all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Gets a bit tiresome after a while. But this was a lie.
Yeah, I'm less interested in those parts as I am in just the shots of like an interview with a higher up in the British Army being distracted by a fly buzzing around the room.
Right, yeah. Or wasn't there a bunch of like American soldiers in a laundry, like kind of getting into it? Do you remember a sequence like that as well?
How about Silence then, which was your next pick, the only Martin Scorsese film on this list?
Yes. So this is, again, like, this film suffers. I'm going to be brief so we can go a bit faster. But like, this film suffers a bit from having Andrew Garfield in it, in a part that I think was originally written for Willem Dafoe. And that basically means that he doesn't quite have the muscle to get this movie over the hill in the way that Willem Dafoe did. It's a movie about Portuguese missionaries in Japan in the, I think, 18th century, 19th century. I think it might be 18th century. Sometime in the past, Portuguese missionaries in Japan, looking for their old teacher, who's played by Liam Neeson, and it's Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield. But it is actually a film which is about, the silence of the title refers to the silence of from God to man over the course of 2,000 years, and it is a film that is about the terror of living in a godless universe. And the terror of feeling like your faith is completely unacknowledged and unobserved. And again, it's another very long movie. It feels very personal to Martin Scorsese because he's a sort of lifelong Catholic. I myself am not a Catholic. I'm not a believer, but I found the themes in the movie intensely moving and resonant because it is a movie about trying to find meaning and trying to preserve something of yourself in a kind of impossible situation, and it's just a really interesting movie in how it engages with the problem of evangelism, like what different religions mean to different cultures, and how that can end in sort of terrible violence. So it has a kind of colonial side to it as well. So yeah, I think it's a little bit underrated. I think people found it a bit ponderous when it came out, but I actually thought it was one of the best movies released that year.
Hmm.
Yeah, really, really, really good. And Andrew Garfield, like I say, a little bit underpowered. I think he's come into his own a bit more now, but he's playing a big old like part in that movie. And Adam Driver's playing the kind of secondary part, and in retrospect, it probably should have been
Hmm.
the other way around. But yeah, no, I definitely recommend it. It's really good.
It's one of the few Martin Scorsese films, at least released during my life, that I haven't seen. So I really do want to, especially since it's got Adam Driver in it, and that man has never been anything other than extremely watchable.
Yep,
Um,
not in it enough is what you'll think when you see it.
my next film is I felt like I wanted to put this on the list because it is one of the kind of most artfully constructed, crowd-pleasing films. There's nothing especially deep about it, but it is just a brilliant, um, exhilarating piece of filmmaking. Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World. It's based on an amalgamation of the brilliant naval novels by Patrick O'Brian. This film follows the HMS Surprise in the Age of Sail, and its bluff and faintly sort of ridiculous but valiant captain Jack Aubrey, played by Russell Crowe, and he and his ship are pursuing a formidable French frigate called Acheron, which has been preying on the British whaling fleet. And what follows is just this sort of nautical cat and mouse, where the roles of cat and mouse keep on interchanging. And at the center of it, there's this, it sort of preserves at least the kind of notional idea of this friendship between Aubrey, the captain, and his eccentric and particular surgeon, Stephen Maturin, who is also a natural philosopher and interested in Darwin's theories of evolution and examining the islands nearby for various creatures. I love the books. I think I really want to do a lock-in on this film if I can convince anybody to join me, because I think it's just a formidable piece of filmmaking.
It's so
Incredibly
good,
exciting.
and it's such a tragedy that he didn't make like 9 of these movies because
Yeah.
it's so easily they could have done. And I think all the people involved were very much up for doing that, and it kind of got overshadowed by Lord of the Rings type stuff. I think at the time, and kind of
Mm.
wasn't anything like I think maybe they might have released it the same day as Lord of the Rings or something
Oh,
like that.
really?
Maybe I mean that can't possibly be true. I know at the awards season, it was the year that Return of the King, the worst Lord of the Rings movie, well up to that date, won everything, and I think it was sort of robbed there. But I also love this film. It's completely unique, really. There's never been a movie that's paid so much attention to the particulars of the era and the period, and the combat is really exciting. The characters are a great laugh. The swashbuckling levels are through the roof. Yeah, it's just great, and it's also it's directed by Peter Weir, who is someone who's
Mm.
just made a series of absolutely fascinating movies. His run, from sort of Picnic at Hanging Rock,
Mm.
the Year of Living Dangerously, Witness, The Mosquito Coast, Dead Poet Society, Green Card, Fearless, The Truman Show, and Master and Commander. I mean, I just think that's one of the best filmographies anyone's ever had. Yeah. So I would definitely be up for locking in on that at
Oh,
some
excellent.
point. Yeah. uh, so my next two are both Cronenberg movies, but by different Cronenbergs. So it's Spider, directed by David Cronenberg. This is one that it's about a man who's kind of returning to life, going back to a halfway house after spending a long time in an institution. He's played by Ralph Fiennes. And then it is also flashing back to his childhood, where his parents are played by Gabriel Byrne and Miranda Richardson playing his mother. And he basically tells the story through these flashbacks of the origin of this guy, and the terrible thing that happened in his house. I think mainly it's a very interesting, like psychological thriller. You wouldn't call it particularly thrilling, but it is kind of a kind of it does unfold in a series of sort of revelations. I think the main reason I'm including it here is Miranda Richardson's performance is incredible. Without spoiling too much, she plays several different characters in the movie in a way that's kind of invisible. the movie in a similar way to a lot of Cronenberg movies is about how identity can be blurred. In this case, in the kind of twisted mind of a disturbed individual, and Miranda Richardson does an incredible job of playing different projections of someone else's psyche. Essentially, yeah, it's a really disturbing movie, I think. Although a little bit more hopeful than some of the others we've mentioned here today.
Yeah, I don't recall a lot about it. I remember liking it when it came out. But it sort of blurs into other films in my memory because there's a sort of like spate of a couple of years where there was sort of a borderline between British social realism and horror. There was a film called Young Adam, which had Tilda Swinton and Ewan McGregor in it, which I find difficult to separate in my imagery of it, in my memory from Spider. And
Yeah,
then
it's
even into things
canals.
like
Lots of canals,
yeah,
grotty canal movies.
and then like things like Dead Man's Shoes by Shane Meadows as well. All seem to be of this the kind of like mini oeuvre that occurred in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it was a weird time for that sort of stuff. There is particularly with a sort of fixation on masculinity as well, and sort of maleness. It did seem like particularly, that's always been where Shane Meadows kind of played as well, and so it's kind of interesting vibe that. David Cronenberg is a movie maker who sometimes I absolutely adore. More than often than not, he really annoys me. Like that movie Maps to the Stars that came out a couple of years ago. I can't remember feeling as like revolted by a movie as I was by that. I found it so tedious and annoying and revolting and self-satisfied. Possessor, Brandon Cronenberg, who is David Cronenberg's son. This movie came out a couple of years ago. You can watch a like unrated, X-rated cut or whatever it is. That's the one to watch if you want to track this one down. It is a body swap movie starring Andrea Riseborough and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Very much in the kind of his dad's genre. He's kind of really embracing his dad's kind of major hits for this movie. It basically takes place in a world where Andrea Riseborough can invade other people's bodies in order to sort of steal secrets or kill people. And it basically takes the body swap trope and makes it about privacy in the modern age, which is a real genius stroke. It's deeply unsettling, really violent, really, really horrible. Really like one of those movies you want to take, like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, one of those movies you want to take like a bath in vim afterwards. It's just so gross. But Andrea Riseborough's never been better. And the idea that it has at its core of like, what would it be like if two people shared the same body? And the answer being really, really awful. Really, really awful is really good. It's kind of good fun as well in a kind of appalling way. So yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, to hear Brandon Cronenberg talk about it, though, this is completely independent of anything his father has ever done, and he's a filmmaker striking out on his own, which is a bold statement to make.
I just think, like when Stephen King sang Joe Hill, it's clearly at some point he just went, "Fuck it, I'm just going to write variations on it. Who cares? I'm going to have a great time doing it." I think there's nothing wrong with it.
Indeed.
Says the man who basically like got his way into his own career by trading off his own dad's credit. Zoo is a documentary about bestiality. Do you remember the guy who was? Do you remember the guy who was fucked to death by a horse? Remember that guy? It is a documentary about that guy, and it is an extraordinary movie about a place where you could go in the wilds of America and basically have sex with animals. But the movie is extraordinary, really, because it is in no way gaudy or exploitative or, it's an incredibly sober, incredibly serious examination of this kind of fundamental line between man and beast and what a kind of atrocious violation it is when people step across that line like these men were doing. What drew them to do that? What kind of people were they? What's the guy like who owns this farm? Where's he come from? Stuff like that. So it is a dark and disturbed movie again, but it is fascinating on a very, very weird and disturbed world. it's not it's not a film that's full of upsetting imagery, I would say, but it is a movie that is full of upsetting themes.
That sounds horrible. Thank you.
Yeah, I've really got to cheer up with these, don't I?
Well, I mean, that's not going to help with the next film, which is actually quite relevant. Grizzly Man, which is a documentary by Werner Herzog, and it documents the life and death of Timothy Treadwell, who befriended and lived with grizzly bears. He didn't try and fuck any of them, as far as we know, but ultimately, and very sadly, he gets almost inevitably he gets killed and eaten by them, along with his girlfriend. And Herzog is just, so I think this might have been my first encounter with Herzog, but he's so typically deadpan. I'm not sure if he is a nihilist, but there is certain nihilism to the way he deconstructs the sort of romantic fantasies of anthropomorphism that led this man to just project his human understanding of relationships onto wild animals. And but at the same time, like as quickly as sort of like Herzog discards that cross-species empathy, if you like, as a form of delusion or vanity, he sort of also shows incredible compassion towards the deluded, towards Treadwell, and particularly to his girlfriend, Amy Hugengard, who obviously didn't need to die. And the other film of his that I would put in this top 50 is Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is our only 3D film. And I'm not sure it's a particularly amazing documentary, but it is remarkable in the way that it uses 3D cameras to cast new light, literally, onto the 32,000-year-old hand paintings found in this cave network in France. And it uses the facility of 3D to demonstrate like how these paintings are sort of prehistoric animations, because they use not just the shape of the cave wall, but also the way that the flickering illumination of firelight would cast upon it to suggest movement. And that's something that only this film could have done with the technology that he had at his disposal. Inevitably, because it's a Herzog film, he just gets distracted from that, though, and ends up interviewing a weirdo who believes he can locate caves by smell. It's just, very tangential, but also funny. If people aren't totally familiar with Werner Herzog, I saw a quote from him from one of his earlier films the other day, from Burden of Dreams, in which he says, "The jungle is full of obscenity. Nature here is vile and base. There is a lot of misery, but it is the same misery that's all around us. The trees here are in misery, and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing. They just screech in pain." Which is just delectable.
Very good. Yeah, you do a mean Herzog there.
Oh, thanks, man.
I would also add Encounters at the End of the World, which is another documentary from around the same era, which is him going to Antarctica and meeting all the weirdos who live there.
Oh, yeah.
That's a very good one, too. Next up is our only Japanese manga film, anime film, Your Name by Makoto Shinkai. This completely knocked my socks off when I saw it a couple of years ago. It was an absolute smash hit over in Japan and elsewhere, I think. But completely took me off guard. It is a movie about the relationship. It's another body swap movie, but much more romantic, really, about a young girl who lives in the countryside and a boy who lives in the city, and they have a sort of body swap thing going on. Aside from the fact that the movie spends an immense amount of time showing how he enjoys groping his breasts when he is in the teenage girl's body, which I was just so done with by the first time it happens in the movie, and it keeps happening. Aside from that, it is an extraordinarily beautiful movie. I don't think I've ever seen a movie with with artistry on the scale of Your Name. The detailing in the world, in the cities and in the countryside, everything in between, is just absolutely unparalleled as far as I can tell. Every single frame, every single shot is just been obsessed over and perfected. And then it has a really, aside from the breast groping, it has this really beautiful love story at the heart of it, which goes in like kind of very unusual directions. It's kind of, I mean, it's kind of not that unusual if you've ever played a Japanese RPG. Actually, it has that kind of sort of mystical childhood type stuff, which is kind of a little bit tropey to my eyes. But again, it's a movie that has a kind of gentle Japanese like singer songwriter folk music on the soundtrack, which just works for it. It just works really well. It's a completely amazing movie that is I've never seen anything quite like it.
Wow, big blind spot for me.
I think you'd like that one. It's very good. Yeah, it's so like it's a good movie to watch with a partner as well because it's a good kind of it's got a nice it's romantic. It's a romantic movie, I guess.
Not convinced with the breast groping stuff, but I'll.
Oh man, it's such a fucker. That it's so stupid. It's like the one really really sour note in the whole thing.
Your next film is Mean Girls.
Oh, Mean Girls.
Classic.
Yeah. Oh, I love Mean Girls so much. This was a late edition for me, but I realised I couldn't not include it. Not that I intend to talk about this stuff a lot, but like when we came up with Skins, I think we were basically just trying to remake Mean Girls because Mean Girls is awesome. Like the way that the teenagers are presented in it with a sort of mixture of a reverence and heart, and the way that kind of everyone is kind of ridiculous. It's a movie about, everyone knows this movie. It's a movie about a new girl in school who's come from Africa, and kind of takes up with the mean girls of the title, and kind of it's about how she navigates school and in and out of this Queen Bee group, and it's written by Tina Fey. Just endlessly quotable, endlessly funny. Film I could just watch again and again and again, and I have done. I don't know what else to say about it. Really, it's just a pure joy.
Yeah, my memories of it are a bit hazy because it seems to blur into Clueless as well for me, which is a stupid thing for it to. But it happens.
I think the mixture of it's a really nice mixture in that it's a nice like teenage, sort of drama, but it has a real like actual wit and sense of humor to it, obviously brought by Tina Fey, which really marks it out as unusual because I think whenever teen drama tries to be too knowing, it can come off as very arch and strange, or if it tries to be like go the other way and treat them with too much reverence, then you end up with sort of 10 Things I Hate About Youism. So it's like you want to be somewhere between Dawson's Creek and Buffy, and it's like it's a very tight line to walk. And I think Mean Girls does just the best job of it because it is laugh out loud, funny as well.
I want to talk about another documentary. This one, Tabloid, by the documentary maker Errol Morris, who's really interesting because he uses this technique which seems particular to Morris, where he interviews people via a series of mirrors such that he can talk to them face to face and they can see him, but while they're doing so, they're actually looking directly into a camera. And the effect is really remarkable, especially because he often interviews psychopaths or compulsive liars, and it's fascinating to stare
criminals.
into their yeah, well, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting to stare into like Robert McNamara's eyes, for example, unblinking as he dissembles or deludes himself, as much as he's attempting to delude the person he's talking to. And he's used this technique on not just Robert McNamara, but other famous pieces of shit like Donald Rumsfeld. And I think those interviews are just of global importance in understanding US politics and foreign policy and the kinds of people who get to be put in charge of those things. But neither of those documentaries involve bondage, kidnapping, Mormons, or animal cloning, and Tabloid has the full fucking sweep. It focuses on the life of maniac Joyce McKinney, who's a woman who, let's say, goes to some lengths to get her a man. And the story then plays out and becomes this tabloid feeding frenzy in the 1970s of Britain. But it's crazy. It goes some places, but really what's so mesmerizing about it is talking to somebody who is either a liar or a fantasist, and just somehow doing so directly manages to pierce something about them and expose them. in a way which I don't find a lot of other documentary makers manage to get through, that sort of defense of people who are completely self-deluded.
Yeah, no, it's a really good. It's really fun because it's one of those stories that's kind of in that sort of stranger than fiction mold, and it keeps twisting and turning and heading off in crazy directions. And it's one of those things where he rejoices in the fact that the story doesn't really have an ending. It doesn't really have a
Yeah.
conclusion. It just meanders on in the way that life does, into kind of more and more weirdness and becoming less and less kind of more and more opaque as it goes. And I think he's really good at that. He's really good at making documentaries that don't have an ending. My favorite movie of him is the one called Mr. Death, which is about
Mm.
a real weirdo who was a guy who was kind of brought in by prisons to help design electric chairs for them, and other methods of lethal injection, and somehow ends up becoming a Holocaust denier because he's brought in to check during a libel case against an actual Holocaust denier, to check the gas chambers for chemical traces and stuff like that, and ends up. And it's a real like banality of evil type movie, absolutely scintillating, very disturbing. Yeah, it's a good one, Mr. Death. Uh, So, my last couple here. Best in Show by Christopher Guest. Just one of the funniest movies ever made.
Mm.
So packed with hilarious characters. It's about the various people who are turning up to a dog show. And, and it's about, the lead up to, and then the denouement of this dog show that happens, of these ridiculous animals. Made in his signature style, which involves writing a kind of scene guide along with Eugene Levy, and then letting the actors improvise their way through those scenes. Just a kind of amazing cast of just the kind of best comic talent in America at the time. Michael McQueen, I think in particular, is amazing, but you could single out about 20 other people in that movie for doing amazing turns. Fred Willard as the dog commentator in the last act of the movie is just absolutely extraordinary and hilarious. And yeah, it's like a lot of Christopher Guest movies. It has a real like meanness to it, which often kind of blanches into sweetness, which I just think is wonderful when he gets it right. And yeah, it's very silly. The dogs are great to look at because they're also ridiculous, and just a very very funny, laugh out loud funny movie. Yeah,
And the final pick.
Into the Spider-Verse. This is a very late edition, actually. I just remembered how much fun I had watching this movie. This movie has 3 directors, and then Phil Lord and Chris Miller as well being involved with it as producers and writers. It is essentially it takes the Miles Morales incarnation of Spider-Man, who is a young black kid version who's I think his dad's a cop, and his Uncle Ben sort of version is actually a criminal guy himself. Maybe I'm spoiling too much there. But yeah, it's an animated take on Spider-Man, which brings in all different versions and incarnations of Spider-Man from different parallel worlds to kind of come together to fight an evil. The thing I loved about it is it's a movie that refound the joy of animated action for me. I find so many action movies to be tedious grinds through whatever the fuck. And I thought that Into the Spider-Verse, aside from being incredibly beautiful, has a kinetic and visceral sense to the action scenes that are massively lacking from a lot of superhero movies. So for me, it really worked as a superhero movie. They directly quote from the runaway train sequence in Spider-Man 2, which is still really awesome. And they do a version of it in there. And it feels like they kind of took that as a inspiration or jumping off point. It has a really wonderful story and really great writing at the heart of it as well. And it kind of has a lot of respect for its property while still managing to be incredibly irreverent with it. I guess that's the same trick that they pulled with the Lego movie. But yeah, it's just really good, a really, really good movie. And I was amazed that they had 3 directors, and the way that they made it was they just embraced chaos. And it all came together when it just as easily couldn't. I mean, these are guys who were fired off the Star Wars movie. for precisely that reason. So it's kind of amazing that at the same time, basically, they managed to pull together the best superhero movie I think anyone's made in the last 20 odd years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I came out of that thinking, oh, was that the best film of the year?
Yeah.
That would be the best film of the year. Completely unexpected, but it is so nimble and literate, even though obviously the things that it is referencing are other aspects of Spider-Man, which could lend it a sort of air of triviality, but it doesn't ever take itself too seriously, even as it's doing quite clever things with this material. Yeah,
I like that it finds in like its final act, like what it does with the villain of the piece and what he's going through at the time, manages to be like really powerful and actually like frightening, like what's driving the villain in the movie and what he's trying to do. It feels genuinely unnerving and sort of aberrant, and I think that's really cool. It feels like a really scary villain in an era where often villains are just like, oh well, Paul Dano's playing the Riddler now, great,
Well, that's all 50. We've
Wow.
ticked off, bestiality, incest, murder, talking bears who are just, after lovely marmalades. All the kinds of things you want from a list of films, basically. Thank you for going on that journey with me. That's given me lots of things I will go away and check out at length. But if you wanted to revisit any of these in a larger format, I'd be up for that for sure.
That's right.
That's definitely all the time we had for this podcast. If you'd like to send us a question, you can do that at questions@Crate&Crowbar. You can tweet us at Crate&Crowbar. You can listen to these recordings, which are uploaded as videos to YouTube, where you can find other stuff by us. The address for that is youtube.com/Crate&Crowbar. Thanks as always to our backers on Patreon, who are not charged for these special lock-ins. They're just charged for the ordinary video games podcast. You can back us too at patreon.com/Crate&Crowbar. Or you can simply join our lovely Discord community, the link for which is on our website, crateandcrowbar.com. That's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Jamie Britton.
Thanks for listening, everybody.